So today we will discuss the ActBlue money laundering scheme, why it matters, how it works, how essentially anyone who doesn't mind breaking the law can go ahead and do the same thing, and who benefits from this operation in Washington state and what can really be done about it. Now, I believe this is important to discuss in the context of who funds, influences, and owns our political class, and of course how they use these funding gravy trains to maintain political power, and then why it should matter to every one of us, regardless of where we live or how far somebody might want to bury their head in the sand. Because, yeah, I'm sorry, but these issues, they impact everyone. That includes you. And while you may not care about politics, that doesn't mean that these guys don't care about you. And I don't really mean that in a good sense. I mean that in the way that they're demonstrating their interest in you every day. How much of your money can they take from you? How much abuse are you actually willing to take in the name of whatever pet cause, scheme, or crisis that they manufacture? How openly can they trash your child's education before you realize that your kid can't do basic math or write a literate paragraph without the help of ChatGPT? How easy are you to manipulate into believing their ever-changing narrative and propaganda about what an awesome job that they do when they're in charge of things? Now, questions like these are what they ask about you and I don't think it's realistic to believe that you can just run away from it all and hide. I don't think you're going to be able to delay the inevitable for a short time maybe, but that's not likely to last. But before we get into this story, as crazy as it might be, I want to encourage everyone watching this video to go ahead and hit the like, subscribe, and notification buttons down below. It actually costs you nothing but just a few seconds, and it helps this video and channel get just that much more visibility, even with all the obvious shadow banning and attempts to silence our stories that Google and others are trying. And go ahead and leave a comment below and share this video link with your friends. You can text it to them, your neighbors, your political opponents, all people who probably need to hear the truth just as well. Finally, if you really like our work, go below. Feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter on our website for free, or if you're just feeling super generous in these uncertain times, you can also donate to our efforts financially, directly below on the website link below. Now, back to this ActBlue money laundering story that I'm explaining to you today. I think it's bigger than most people really realize. And I'll explain the history of how we got here and the unwillingness of the politically powerful probably to investigate it. And I will also review how Washington State, Bob Ferguson, and Governor Jay Inslee are the biggest beneficiaries of this scam in our state. Then I'll give you directions on how I think you can do your own research so that if you're interested, you can also help look up some of this information for yourself, and in the process, help us create the evidence that we need for some formal investigations. So now back to ActBlue, which is the money laundering scheme and kind of this elite political class benefits from. And here's just a bit of background for the story. I mean, ActBlue is essentially a leftist-oriented fundraising company, and they don't hide this fact. I've linked to them down below. They were founded in 2004, and they've funneled about $12 billion into the coffers of left-leaning politicians, PACs, and other causes over the past few years. Now, they began their corporate life modestly enough, but they've grown into a financial powerhouse, just funneling rivers of cash to various left-leaning politicians and causes over the years. If you're a Democrat and you're not hooked up to the ActBlue cash needle, you likely won't achieve your financial goals of raising serious cash. ActBlue has become the single largest fire hose of campaign cash in America today. Nobody else is even close. Now, there's nothing new about shady operations funding political campaigns, and please understand this. The whole reason campaign finance laws were created in our nation and in our state 50 years ago was really because of concerns about the significant influence of dark money donors using their cash to influence the political class to do their bidding. I mean, historically, this was always the concern, particularly with the potential for countries overseas trying to find ways to influence election results, or rich billionaires or corporations or other special interests essentially buying friendly politicians for their own interests. As contribution transparency requirements became more pervasive in the law, and as the internet and online reporting tools became more accessible to the general public, it has become increasingly difficult to conceal the source of these campaign contributions. Now, ActBlue was one of the first kind of mega corporate entities to recognize the power of crowdsourcing the contribution process, to bombard political messages directly to likely supporters, just in an efficient and kind of a low-cost way to encourage very small contributions that can be aggregated to produce larger dollar amounts for the politicians and causes they support. And this adds a lot of obvious benefits to the recipients of the campaign cash. First of all, it has grown into a lot of money. Secondly, the contributions average as small dollar contributions, but that takes a spotlight off individual donors, and it implies that there's just this big grassroots support for the candidates. And it's actually a lot easier and more efficient to kind of vacuum up this cash than to put on a $25,000 per plate fundraiser, for example, which really takes a lot of time and organizing to pull off. Now, as a candidate, all you really need to do is just get the program running efficiently on ActBlue, and you can cut down on your fundraising stops, and as long as you are one of the chosen ones who gets ActBlue support, you can spend more time campaigning and less time fundraising. And that sounds great, right? I mean, and this is perfectly legal, by the way. It is. Don't get me wrong, as we clarify how the scheme has evolved, you will see what it is not legal about the operation, but the basic theory and how it's supposed to work is legal. So if you look back on Obama's first 2008 and his 2012 campaign, this is where this method of fundraising really came into its own and proved that massive amounts of cash could be raised in this manner. And nobody would really look too closely at how the cash was collected. Obama's 2012 campaign in particular really demonstrated massive success in this area, although there were some problems. For example, the 2008 campaign was fined $375,000 for violations, which was pocket change, of course, for the first billion-dollar political campaign in America. Plus, I'll point out that this fine settlement really wasn't even finalized until after the 2012 campaign, 4 years later, until it was over. So it took 4 years to investigate and settle that case. Now, this fine was mostly related to the Obama campaign concealing the identities of big dollar donors and other related violations, not really so much because of the ActBlue support at the time. However, the first time I remember hearing about the abuse of the small dollar donor contribution racket was about 10 years ago during the 2012 Obama campaign, when certain security checks for credit cards and including contributions from overseas were turned off to better facilitate this river of cash of contributions that were flowing into the campaign. Now, the campaign ignored these concerns, of course, and while there were reports issued at the time about the deficiencies in the federal election law for these types of contributions and election law violations, generally the press covered, and they covered up the Obama campaign, and the concerns died away after the Obama victory that year. Now, they were raised again, of course, during the 2016 presidential campaign. Hillary Clinton was the primary beneficiary of the ActBlue fundraising efforts that cycle. And while the Republicans whined a bit about potentially shady funding practices at the time, like most Republican operations, they were mostly interested in fighting each other. They did very little but whine, and they were mostly incompetent in their efforts to research, investigate, or resolve any problems that they might have found. I was told by people involved in the investigations at the time that their efforts were kind of stymied, but I can't really verify this now. It's just what I was told at the time. Now, by the way, the Clinton campaign was fined later by the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, but that fine had nothing to do with ActBlue. It was about their efforts to launder campaign cash through Seattle-based law firm Perkins Coie in an effort to conceal the source of funds that was used to create the now widely mocked and debunked Russian dossier, which was effectively used to attack Trump while he was president. And that was another wrist-slap $100,000 fine kind of quietly issued a few years ago. I've linked these finds and stories below, by the way, in case you want to better research this background. So let's fast forward to the ActBlue scandal unfolding right now today. For years, insiders who were looking at campaign finance data were raising red flags about the shady and weird data that was kind of popping out of the ActBlue report, showing up in FEC reports, and to a lesser extent on the Public Disclosure Commission, PDC, which is the Washington state equivalent of the FEC. However, in order to actually get a handle on this type of campaign finance problem, you really have to understand first the law, and then secondly, you have to understand how to document violations. And in order to do that, you need to know how to utilize large data sets. Usually this requires some database skills. And I know this sounds simple, but there are just not that many people looking at this stuff. And as usual, most people assume that somebody else is going to be doing it. Now, I'm going to explain this visually so that it's easier to understand. And here's how campaign contributions are supposed to work. ActBlue donor from Puyallup, Washington, say, he decides that he loves Bob Ferguson, and they really do. Maybe they like the fact that he plays chess, maybe Bob's repetitive lawsuits against Trump were amusing, or they love the fact that Bob Ferguson always gives a pass to Antifa rioters. Who knows why, and it really doesn't matter. This donor essentially wants to give $15 to Ferguson, and they love Biden too, so maybe they want to give $5 to Biden. And it doesn't really matter. It works essentially the same. We'll just focus on the Ferguson contribution for now. ActBlue acts as the middleman, essentially processing the contribution to Ferguson and Biden or whoever, and ActBlue takes a cut of the contribution. The donor feels good about giving some money, and Bob Ferguson gets the financial support from one of his supporters. Everyone wins, and it is perfectly legal. If this is all that was going on here, there would be nothing really to say. Small dollar donor gives cash to politician. Big deal. ActBlue, however, appears to be participating in another type of funding operation entirely, and this one isn't legal at all, and I'll explain now how it works. So we're back to this excited Ferguson donor, okay? Sure, he still loves Ferguson, but he has a hard time keeping a job, and he'd rather spend his cash on video games and meth, so he can only spend so much cash to Ferguson. So he's kind of tapped out after he sent his first $15 contribution. However, now he exists as an identified donor on the ActBlue site and in the FEC or PDC databases as a small dollar donor. Now, we have big dollar donors who, for various reasons, might want to conceal their identity, but they also love Bob Ferguson quite a bit. Maybe it's somebody like the con artist Sam Bankman-Fried, who has openly admitted to concealing his contributions to candidates in a variety of illegal ways. Maybe it's billionaire George Soros, who funnels money to leftist causes all over the place. Both these guys are some of the largest donors to the Democrats in America today, so they could be seeking more ways to kick cash to Ferguson. Or perhaps it's a corporation like Pfizer, which really loves Ferguson's protection of their vaccine mandate, and they made billions from Ferguson's scorched earth tactics on local businesses during the COVID chaos and Inslee's general lockdown panic. Or perhaps it's something even shadier, like the Sinaloa Mexican drug cartel. I mean, thankfully, maybe they like Ferguson, that how he's protecting the illegal drug addiction and homeless camp racket in Seattle. Or perhaps it's just those mysterious Nigerian fraud scammers who supposedly stole $1 billion from Washington State just a few years ago, and they want to show their appreciation for the fact that Ferguson did nothing about their theft. Now, regardless of what the source of shady cash might be, these big dollar donors can now use the identity of the small dollar donor and send cash to Ferguson in a way that conceals their identities. They essentially send it in this guy's name. So this small dollar donor, in most cases, he has no idea that this is happening in his name. This is illegal. It violates both federal and state law. Now, this is a simplification of the problem uncovered and exposed recently, because we're really talking about here is massive straw donor programs using thousands and tens of thousands of mostly unemployed or retired donor identities who suddenly are making thousands and then tens of thousands of small contributions repeatedly over just months to a wide range of Democrat and leftist politicians. Yes, this is completely and totally illegal. And again, it does mock federal and state law. Now, I think that they were able to get away with this type of scam if they were just able to keep it to a concealable level. It has probably been going on for many years now. But they appear to have gotten greedy, and they can't find enough small contributors to mask the volume of cash that they're trying to funnel to their favorite politicians. So that is why thousands of these microdonors now stand out in the database searches with bizarrely, improbable levels of contribution activity. And this is why people like James O'Keefe, formerly with Project Veritas and now with OMG Productions, how they're visiting the homes of these so-called donors and then discovering that they're denying that they're making the volume and amount of contributions. And in many cases, it is obvious they couldn't even afford to make that volume of contributions even if they wanted to do so. Now, their identities are public and obviously being used now as a way to mask the true source of this cash. That's called money laundering. Now, listen, I know what you're thinking. Shouldn't somebody investigate this? And I'm glad you asked that question, of course, because they should, but will they? And in my opinion, it seems improbable, and let's discuss why. First, at a federal level, nearly every single Democrat elected recently to office, they've greatly benefited from the billions of dollars funneled into their campaign using ActBlue. And this doesn't mean that these campaigns were actively involved in committing financial campaign activity violations themselves, but they were beneficiaries of this process. So how likely do you think it is that they are going to investigate this? Yeah, they're not going to be looking very hard. And this is particularly true if a bunch of them would have to cough up their ill-gotten gains as beneficiaries of the law-breaking. At the most, I'd expect them to maybe call ActBlue and tell them to get things a little bit less obvious. I mean, this is the best case scenario that we're going to get from that crowd. I mean, they've benefited from this. Now, would the Federal Department of Justice actually look into this? I believe this is also completely unlikely, and for them to do that would require them to want to uncover the truth in this case. And this is probably a rock that nobody in the Federal Department of Justice wants to turn over. I mean, the Federal Department of Justice has become so politicized in recent years that there's just no scenario I can envision where they would be willing to hold anyone accountable if the result would be a blow-up on the Democrat Party side of things like this. And you've heard of the too big to fail when applied to banks. Well, I call this the too damaging to expose the truth. And I'm nearly certain that even if the DOJ gets dragged into investigating the scam, that they will do their best to delay the investigation, drag it out for years, work really hard to shift the blame. Where are those Nigerian fraudsters when you need them? Or they're going to just say that there's nothing to see here. Whatever the excuse they use, I find it very unlikely they're going to do anything. Now, this general apathy will apply to our state as well, because look at who the beneficiaries of this ActBlue scam are. The top two are Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson and State Governor Jay Inslee. Exactly how likely is it that they're going to dig very deep into this one? It's zero. Bob Ferguson will probably blame me for doing this video. Jay Inslee will ignore it, and the PDC will muddle around trying to see if there's anything that they can do to pretend that this isn't happening. They won't look into this on their own. Now, I'll probably prep some complaints that dig into the details, but it will be kind of a big task to expose the truth on this one. Now wait, I know what you are already saying. What about the corporate media? Will they cover this story and demand accountability? And yeah, people like the Seattle Times, King 5 News, or the Spokesman Review. Yeah, sorry to pop your bubble there, but this is the type of story that they've been told is totally off limits for them. Most of the traditional media sites in our state, just like in most places of our country, they've been warned that they will be censored and lose their political access card if they expose the truth on stories like this one. I seriously doubt that any of them will discuss this one unless they've been instructed to pretend that it's some type of Russian disinformation campaign or some other right-wing plot. Just read the Twitter files and you're going to understand that most of the media is in on the censorship game right now, and that's why the story took so long to expose and why only non-traditional media groups are going to pay any attention to this. But you can help in two different ways if you're interested in making an impact. And I suspect if you've stayed engaged in this video this long, you just might be. So I've linked to a variety of articles and websites down below where you can start to help us crowdsource this story a bit more so that we can file effective and useful complaints. Now, why would I file complaints on this issue? Well, because I do it all the time anyway. Just look at my website linked below where I document the hundreds of politicians that I've already had fined and sanctioned for their violations in the past. I'd like to file some effective complaints against Inslee and Ferguson on this one too. Not so much because I expect it's going to change the world, but because in some cases they may be forced to refund the money. And if enough formal complaints are filed, I suspect there may be a reduction in this type of open corruption as it applies to our campaign finance laws, at least in this state and perhaps in our country. Now, most of the complaints I've filed in the past have resulted in fines and sanctions under either the PDC campaign finance laws in our state or with various state ethics boards at the local and state level. Now, I might as well start doing the same thing at the federal level too. And here's where and how you can help me with the documentation that we need for these complaints to be effective. Essentially, there are two types of violations. The first are violations that fall under RCW 4217A, which is the state campaign finance laws. Now, we have to find people who have been used as smurfs or straw men for these contributions. And remember, most of them don't even know this has been done in their name. Some of them may not even care, but if they admit that they didn't make the thousands of contributions made in their name over the past few months, then we have evidence to support the complaint. And I'm very happy to file those as best I can. However, no matter how many we can find, really. Now, I don't want to harass the donors. It's really not their fault, so we should only visit them once to verify these strange contributions made in their name. Make sure that really wasn't them. However, and this is what makes it complicated, many of these contributors were from out of state, and this is part of what makes it tricky. Anyone doing this type of bad behavior knows that the people who care about elections and campaign finance violations in Washington State, for example, they probably live here. And we're willing to doorbell and visit anyone in our state who might be violating the law or who's been victimized as part of some type of scam. However, that gets a lot harder when the original straw donor or Smurf is actually located in another state, maybe on the East Coast, for example, or maybe down in California. So for those verifications, I'll probably produce a separate video to describe how to do this type of interview, and I'll link to an article on my website down below detailing the process. Now, in our state, as much as Governor Jay Inslee and AG Bob Ferguson and some others have benefited from this type of ActBlue straw donor scam, the bigger interest might be for those who used Washington state straw donors in our state to benefit your candidates in other states like Texas and Florida. And we'll happily do the doorbelling here in Washington to verify the scams on this end, and we can work with people in other states to process the complaints there. I don't think it matters where you live if you are filing federal FEC complaints, so I believe that we can start filing those right now, and then we can get the ball rolling at this time. No reason to hold back and no reason not to do it. Sure, I know that the FEC and other agencies may try to cover it up, but no reason not to force them to go through the motions and pretend they actually care about some type of rule of law. And we can document what we find and file these complaints, providing the documentation. They become public documents. So you can go to wethegovern.com and I'll provide more details on this entire process there. It's easy to find and step-by-step processes are easy to document. You don't really have to visit hundreds of homes, just do a few near you and get a sense of how it works. Now, like anything else, if you want to have an impact, help us and others in this investigation process and let's see what we find. I mean, after all, in the end, it depends on us. It really does. It depends on you and I. I mean, we're the ones who can make an impact. Please don't assume that somebody else will do it for you. Because remember, ultimately, it's the future that belongs to those who show up.